The morning of June 4th, 1942, broke clear and bright over the Central Pacific. At 0430 hours, Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, flagship of the Kaido Butai, the most powerful naval striking force the world had ever seen. The sea stretched endless and empty in every direction, a vast blue mirror reflecting the confidence of an empire that had known nothing but victory for 6 months. The air smelled of salt and engine oil mingled with the faint breakfast scent of rice and miso soup drifting up from the galleys below. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, cut through the waves in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft painted in the gray-green camouflage of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Nagumo had commanded these ships through the devastation of Pearl Harbor, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, the humiliation of the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean. Every battle had ended the same way, with enemy ships sinking beneath columns of black smoke while Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers in triumph. This morning promised nothing different. The American base at Midway Atoll lay 300 miles ahead, and Nagumo's orders were simple: destroy it, draw out the remnants of the American fleet, and eliminate the final obstacle to Japanese dominance. Of the Pacific what Nagumo could not see, what no Japanese commander could yet comprehend, was that the ocean's emptiness was an illusion. Beneath that deceptive calm, the currents of history were shifting with tectonic force. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, lay hidden beyond the horizon, their crews already at battle stations, their scout planes already airborne, their commanders already reading decoded Japanese messages that laid bare every element of Nagumo's plan. The intelligence advantage was total, absolute, unprecedented in naval warfare. American codebreakers, working in cramped basements in Hawaii and Washington, had cracked the Japanese naval cipher designated JN25, transforming encrypted radio transmissions into readable English text. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew where Nagumo would be when he would arrive, what forces he commanded, and what objectives he pursued. It was as if the Americans could read the Japanese admiral's mind. But Nagumo stood on his bridge in complete ignorance of this fact, confident in the security of his communications, certain in the superiority of his veterans, believing with the faith of a zealot that the Americans were broken, scattered, incapable of meaningful resistance. The Japanese High Command had built its entire Pacific strategy on a foundation of assumptions about American weakness. These assumptions were not random prejudices, but carefully constructed beliefs rooted in cultural analysis and historical precedent. Japanese planners believed that Americans were soft, materialistic, individualistic, a nation of shopkeepers, and factory workers who valued comfort over sacrifice, profit over honor. They had studied American culture through the lens of their own martial traditions and found it wanting. American soldiers, they reasoned, lacked the spiritual discipline of the samurai, the willingness to die for emperor and nation that defined Japanese military excellence. American society, with its jazz music and Hollywood films, its emphasis on personal freedom and material abundance, seemed to Japanese observers a civilization in decline, decadent and self-indulgent, and capable of sustaining the harsh sacrifices demanded by modern war. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been designed not merely to destroy ships, but to break American will, to deliver such a devastating psychological blow that the United States would accept Japanese dominance of Asia rather than endure years of costly fighting. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor operation, had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew America better than most Japanese officers, and he harbored deep misgivings about war with the United States. But even Yamamoto believed that a strategy of rapid conquest and defensive consolidation might force a negotiated peace before American industrial might could be brought to bear. What Japanese planners failed to grasp was that they had fundamentally misread American character. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not break American will, it forged it. The nation that emerged from the shock of December 7, 1941, was not the divided, isolationist America of the 1930s, but a unified industrial colossus committed to total war. Factories that had produced automobiles retooled to build tanks and aircraft at a pace that defied Japanese comprehension. Shipyards that had constructed cargo vessels began launching warships with assembly line efficiency. American women entered, factories by the millions taking jobs previously reserved for men, driving rivets and welding steel with skill and determination that matched any worker in the world. The arsenal of democracy, as President Roosevelt termed it, was awakening, and its productive capacity dwarfed anything the Japanese Empire could marshal. But in June 1942, these realities remained abstract statistics, future projections, theoretical possibilities. The Japanese had not yet felt the full weight of American industrial power translated into combat strength. They had not yet faced the consequences of their miscalculation. That reckoning was about to begin. At 07:02 hours on June 4th, the first American scout plane reported the position of the Japanese carrier force. The transmission crackled through radio sets aboard Enterprise and Hornet. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, made his decision with calculated precision. He would launch an immediate strike, throwing every available aircraft against the Japanese carriers before they could attack Midway and recover their planes. It was a gambler's move, committing his aircraft at extreme range, risking that they might not find the target or might arrive with insufficient fuel to return. But Spruance understood what the Japanese did not, that in carrier warfare the advantage belonged to whoever struck first. The side that caught enemy carriers with their decks crowded with aircraft and fuel lines running, that side would win. Everything else was secondary. At 08:06 hours, the first American aircraft began launching from Enterprise torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, a ragged armada of 116 aircraft rising into the clear morning sky and setting course for the northwest. Nagumo, meanwhile, was experiencing the first hints that something had gone wrong. His morning attack on Midway had launched at 0430 and struck the atoll at 0630, bombing runways and installations but failing to suppress the base completely. The strike leader radioed back, "Second attack necessary." At the same moment, American aircraft from Midway obsolete torpedo bombers and dive bombers flown by Marines began attacking the Japanese carriers. They came in waves, brave and determined. and were slaughtered by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Not a single torpedo hit. The Americans lost dozens of aircraft and crews for no result. Japanese sailors, watching the clumsy attacks and seeing American planes falling in flames, felt their confidence surge. This was the American opposition, poorly trained, poorly equipped, suicidally brave, but tactically incompetent. Nagumo made his decision. He would recover the Midway strike force, rearm them with torpedoes instead of bombs, and prepare for a second strike on the atoll. Then, once Midway was fully suppressed, he would turn his attention to whatever American carriers might be in the area. What Nagumo did not know was that his decision had placed him in a death trap. Rearming aircraft on a carrier deck is a complex, time-consuming process requiring hundreds of sailors to manhandle bombs and torpedoes, to refuel aircraft, to spot planes for launch. During this process, the carrier is maximally vulnerable. Its deck crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, its hangar bays filled with ordnance, its crew exposed and occupied. At 0918 hours, as Japanese sailors labored to prepare the second strike, radar operators detected incoming aircraft. More Americans, coming in low torpedo bombers from the carriers. Nagumo's combat air patrol intercepted them. The American torpedo squadrons attacked with the same suicidal courage as the Marines from Midway, flying slow and low, struggling to reach launch position against overwhelming fighter opposition. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was annihilated. 15 aircraft shot down, 29 men killed, 1 survivor. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14 planes. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown lost 10 of 12. Not a single American torpedo struck its target. Japanese pilots, landing back aboard their carriers, reported with elation that the Americans were broken, that their attacks were futile. That victory was assured. But the American torpedo squadrons had accomplished something far more important than hitting targets. They had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, pulling the Zero fighters away from altitude, leaving the sky above the carriers temporarily undefended. At 10:22 hours, 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, emerged from the clouds at 14,000 feet and saw below them a sight that no American pilot had dared hope for. 4 Japanese carriers, their decks packed with aircraft, their crews frantically working to launch a strike, completely exposed and defenseless. McCluskey made a hand signal, rolled his aircraft into a 70-degree dive, and plunged toward Kaga. Behind him, his squadron followed, one after another, their dive brakes screaming, their bomb sights fixed on the Japanese ships below. The Japanese lookouts saw them too late. Anti-aircraft fire began bursting in the sky, black puffs of smoke that did nothing to stop the plunging Americans. McCluskey released his bomb at 1,500 feet and pulled out of his dive so hard that the G-forces grayed out his vision. The first bomb struck Kaga on the flight deck near the island superstructure, penetrating deep into the hangar bay before detonating. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and ordnance, triggering a chain reaction of secondary detonations that ripped through the ship's vitals. Within seconds, Kaga was transformed from a powerful warship into a blazing funeral pyre. Simultaneous attacks hit Akagi and Soryu. Bombs smashed through their wooden flight decks, exploding in hangar bays filled with armed aircraft and volatile fuel. The results were catastrophic beyond description. Fires spread with impossible speed, feeding on gasoline and oil, consuming aircraft and equipment, trapping sailors below decks. Ammunition cooked off in the heat, sending shrapnel scything through damage control parties. The carriers that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months were dying, and nothing could save them. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge and watched his flagship. Byrne watched sailors jumping into the sea to escape the flames, watched the symbol of Japanese naval supremacy disintegrate before his eyes. At 1,046 hours, 24 minutes after the first bomb struck, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were smoking wrecks, their crews abandoning ship, their aircraft destroyed, their offensive power annihilated. Hiryu, the sole survivor, would launch a desperate counterattack that crippled Yorktown, but American dive bombers would find and destroy Hiryu that afternoon, completing the slaughter. This was the first moment of realization. Vice Admiral Nagumo, staring at the burning wreckage of his fleet, understood with sudden, terrible clarity that Japanese assumptions about American weakness were wrong. The Americans who had attacked with such precision and timing were not soft or undisciplined. They were deadly serious, professionally competent, technologically sophisticated, and utterly determined. The intelligence that had allowed them to position their carriers perfectly, the coordination that had brought their attacks together at the decisive moment, the industrial capacity that had built and equipped 3 fleet carriers in the first place, all of this spoke to a depth of national capability that Japanese planners had not anticipated. Nagumo had expected to face a broken, demoralized enemy, capable only of futile gestures of resistance. Instead, he had encountered an adversary that could match Japan tactically, outthink Japan strategically, and produce weapons and trained personnel at a rate that made sustained war unwinnable. The 4 carriers sinking beneath the Pacific waves represented more than ships. They represented the irreplaceable core of Japan's naval air arm, the veteran pilots and crew who could not be replaced in months or even years, the offensive capability that had made Japanese expansion possible. Without them, Japanese strategy collapsed. The war was not over, but its outcome had been determined in 5 minutes of dive bombing on a clear June morning. The shock of Midway reverberated through the Japanese naval establishment, but many officers dismissed it as a fluke, an unlucky accident that could be overcome through determination and sacrifice. They still did not grasp the fundamental imbalance in industrial capacity that made Japanese defeat inevitable. That understanding would come slowly, painfully, through a series of brutal attritional battles that ground down Japanese strength while American power grew exponentially. The second moment of realization occurred not in a single dramatic engagement, but across months of relentless combat in the waters around Guadalcanal, where Japanese commanders watched their logistical system collapse under the weight of American material superiority. November 12, 1942. Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe commanded a powerful surface force built around the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, escorting troop transports toward Guadalcanal. His orders were to bombard Henderson Field, the American airstrip on Guadalcanal, and suppress it sufficiently to allow the transports to land reinforcements. For 4 months, Japanese and American forces had been locked in a savage struggle. for control of this miserable jungle island in the Solomon Islands chain. The Japanese had underestimated Guadalcanal's strategic importance and the American commitment to holding it. Now, stretched supply lines and constant attrition were bleeding Japanese strength dry. Abe's mission was to reverse the tactical balance by landing fresh troops and destroying American air capability. He approached Guadalcanal through Iron Baton Sound, the strait between Guadalcanal and Savo Island that had earned its grim nickname. From the number of ships sunk in its waters, the night was dark, overcast, the visibility barely 1,000 yards. Abe expected to arrive unopposed, shell the airfield, and withdraw before dawn. Instead, at 0124 hours, American destroyers emerged from the darkness and launched a point-blank torpedo attack. The Battle of Guadalcanal, the first of two brutal night actions bearing that name, exploded into chaotic violence. Ships fired at shadows. Torpedoes crossed the water in every direction. Searchlights stabbed through the darkness, only to draw devastating fire. The American force, commanded by Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, was outgunned and outnumbered, but it threw itself at the Japanese with reckless aggression, disrupting Abe's formation and forcing him into a wild melee at ranges so close that large-caliber guns could not depress enough to hit targets. Destroyers dueled with battleships. Cruisers exchanged broadsides at 3,000 yards. The night sky lit up with muzzle flashes and exploding shells. The noise was indescribable, a continuous rolling thunder of gunfire punctuated by the shriek of shells and the concussive blast of torpedoes. Ships burned, silhouetted against their own fires, easy targets for any gun that could bear. Callahan's flagship, the cruiser San Francisco, traded shots with High A at suicidal range, both ships hammering each other with brutal efficiency. Callahan was killed on his bridge by a Japanese shell. The destroyers Barton, Cushing, Laffey, and Monson were sunk. The cruisers Atlanta and Juneau went down. The Americans suffered devastating losses, but they had achieved their objective. Abe's bombardment force was scattered, disorganized, unable to complete its mission. High A, damaged by American gunfire, limped away from the battle only to be caught by American aircraft at dawn and bombed until it sank. 2 nights later, on November 14th, the Japanese tried again. Vice Admiral Kondō brought a fresh bombardment force south, centered on the battleship Kirishima. Waiting for him was Rear Admiral Willis Lee, with 2 American battleships, Washington and South Dakota, supported by 4 destroyers. Lee positioned his force carefully, using radar to track the Japanese approach in total darkness. The Americans had invested heavily in radar technology, developing sets that could detect ships and aircraft at ranges impossible with optical systems. Lee's radar operators watched green blips on their scopes, translating electronic signals into tactical information, guiding their admiral through the darkness with precision that bordered on clairvoyance. When the forces engaged, the advantage was decisive. American destroyers launched torpedoes and were torn apart by Japanese counterfire. All 4 were sunk or crippled within minutes. South Dakota suffered an electrical failure that knocked out her radar and fire control systems, leaving her blind and helpless, absorbing terrible punishment from Japanese guns. But Washington, undetected in the darkness, close to 8,400 yards and opened fire on Kirishima with their 9 16-inch guns. The American battleship's radar-directed fire was devastatingly accurate. Shell after shell smashed into Kirishima, penetrating armor, exploding inside the ship, wrecking propulsion and steering. Within 7 minutes, Washington had fired 75 main battery rounds and scored at least 9 hits, reducing the Japanese battleship to a floating wreck. Kondō, stunned by the sudden savagery of the American attack, broke off the action and withdrew. Kirishima, her hull torn open, her fires out of control, was scuttled by her crew before dawn. Admiral Kondō, like Nagumo before him, experienced in those confused night battles a moment of profound realization. The Americans were not fighting like a defeated enemy conducting a desperate rearguard action. They were fighting with the confidence of a power that knew it possessed overwhelming long-term advantages. The radar systems that allowed American ships to fight with precision in total darkness represented a technological edge that Japan could not match. Japanese industry had developed radar, but it lagged years behind American capabilities in sophistication and production volume. American ships carried radar sets that were smaller, more reliable, more powerful, and more numerous than anything Japan could field. This technological disparity translated directly into combat effectiveness. American commanders could see and target Japanese ships that remained blind to American presence. The advantage was so profound that it negated traditional Japanese strength in night fighting, optics, and torpedo warfare. But technology was only part of the story. The real shock for Japanese commanders lay in American industrial capacity, the ability to absorb catastrophic losses and return stronger than before. In the naval battles around Guadalcanal between August and November 1942, the United States Navy lost 2 fleet carriers, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. By traditional calculations, such losses should have crippled American naval power in the South Pacific for months or years. Instead, American strength increased. New ships arrived from American shipyards at a rate that stunned Japanese intelligence officers. The Essex-class fleet carriers, the Baltimore-class heavy cruisers, the Cleveland-class light cruisers, the Fletcher-class destroyers, these modern, powerful warships were entering service in numbers that Japan could not counter. American shipyards were building carriers faster than Japan could sink them, building destroyers faster than Japan could count them. In 1942, American shipyards launched 9 escort carriers and 1 fleet carrier. In 1943, they launched 50 escort carriers and 6 fleet carriers. In 1944, the numbers rose to 33 escort carriers and 9 fleet carriers. The scale was incomprehensible to Japanese planners who had calculated that American industrial output, while large, could not be translated into military power quickly enough to affect the war's outcome. The logistical implications were equally devastating. Every American ship that arrived in the South Pacific brought with it fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and supplies in quantities that Japanese forces could only dream of. American sailors ate fresh food prepared in well-equipped galleys. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were starving, reduced to eating tree bark and grass, dying of malnutrition and disease in greater numbers than combat claimed. American aircraft flew with full fuel tanks and carried maximum ordnance loads. Japanese aircraft often flew on half-filled tanks to conserve fuel, reducing their range and combat time. American pilots who were shot down could expect rescue by submarines or flying boats specifically dedicated to search and rescue operations. Japanese pilots who ditched were often left to die in the ocean, their loss permanent and irreplaceable. The accumulation of these logistical advantages created a qualitative gap that no amount of Japanese fighting spirit could overcome. Admiral Reiso Tanaka, commanding the Japanese Tokyo Express destroyer runs that attempted to supply Guadalcanal, fought with brilliant tactical skill and achieved local successes, but he was ultimately engaged in a futile effort to pour water through a sieve. Every ton of supplies his destroyers delivered was a fraction of what his troops required, while American cargo ships unloaded thousands of tons daily at Guadalcanal's ports. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese commanders was the American supply ship, unglamorous, unromantic, but absolutely decisive. American Liberty ships, mass-produced with welded construction techniques that allowed a single shipyard to complete a vessel in weeks, carried the cargoes that sustained American forces in combat. By 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships per day. The ships were slow, ugly, and utilitarian, but they represented something far more important than elegance. They represented surplus. America had so much industrial capacity that it could afford to build ships of mediocre quality in vast numbers, knowing that sheer quantity would overwhelm any opponent. Japan, meanwhile, was struggling to replace combat losses and maintain existing forces. Japanese merchant shipping was being systematically destroyed by American submarines, whose aggressive campaign was strangling Japan's ability to import raw materials and export finished goods. The islands that Japan had conquered to secure resources, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the rice of Indochina, were useless if tankers and cargo ships could not bring those resources to the home islands. American submarines, operating with increasing effectiveness as the war progressed, were severing the economic arteries of the Japanese Empire. By late 1943, Japanese oil imports had dropped to half of pre-war levels. By 1945, they would drop to near zero. The third moment of realization came in October 1944, in the waters off the Philippines, during the largest naval battle in history. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, tasked with breaking through American naval forces and destroying the invasion fleet supporting General MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The plan was desperate, complex, and relied on dividing American attention through multiple simultaneous attacks. Kurita's force approached through the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th, and American carrier aircraft found them in the morning. Wave after wave of American dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked throughout the day. Musashi, the pride of the Japanese fleet, mounting 9 18.1-inch guns and protected by armor that was supposed to make her unsinkable, absorbed an astounding punishment. American pilots counted their hits as the battle progressed. 19 torpedo hits, 17 bomb hits, near misses too numerous to count. Musashi's armor belt stopped some torpedoes, but the cumulative damage was overwhelming. The ship's bow sank lower and lower into the water as flooding spread through her hull. Pumps could not keep up with the inflow. Power systems failed, At 19:35 hours, after enduring nearly 10 hours of continuous attack, Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 sailors with her. The Americans had sunk the largest, most heavily armed battleship ever built, and they had done it with naval aviation attacking from carriers that operated beyond the range of Musashi's guns, launching aircraft in numbers that saturated Japanese defenses. Kurita pressed on. His force emerged from San Bernardino Strait in the early hours of October 25th and turned south toward the American landing beaches. At 06:45 hours, lookouts spotted American ships on the horizon. Kurita's staff officers felt a surge of triumph. They had broken through, and the defenseless transports lay ahead. But as the range closed, they realized with shock that they were facing not transports, but carriers, 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3, small, slow, lightly armed vessels designed for anti-submarine warfare and ground support, not fleet combat. The escort carriers turned and fled, launching aircraft in desperation, their destroyer escorts charging Kurita's battleships in suicidal torpedo attacks. What happened next defied all expectations. The destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts attacked with such ferocity that they disrupted Kurita's formation, forcing his heavy ships to maneuver violently to avoid torpedoes, breaking up coordinated attacks, creating confusion and delay. Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, close to 10,000 yards of the battleship Kondō, and fired torpedoes, then engaged Japanese heavy cruisers with her 5-inch guns, scoring dozens of hits before being overwhelmed and sunk. Hull and Samuel B. Roberts fought until they were reduced to burning wrecks, their guns firing until the sea claimed them. The escort carriers, aircraft Wildcats, and Avengers, armed with whatever ordnance was available, depth charges and rockets, and light bombs attacked with desperate courage, strafing bridge windows, making dry runs after their ammunition was exhausted, doing anything to disrupt Japanese gunnery. Admiral Kurita, standing on Yamato's bridge, watched this chaotic battle unfold and felt his certainty crumble. His staff reported that they were facing fleet carriers, that American cruisers were present in strength, that a major engagement was developing. The reports were wrong, born of confusion, stress, and the disruptive effects of smoke and violent maneuvering, but Kurita believed them. He had been attacking for over 2 hours. His ships had sunk 1 escort carrier and several destroyers, and yet American resistance showed no signs of collapsing. American aircraft continued to arrive wave after wave, attacking his ships with relentless determination. Kurita's own communications were fragmentary and confused. He did not know that the Japanese Southern Force had been destroyed the previous night in Surigao Strait, that the Northern Force's carriers had successfully lured Admiral Halsey's Maine fleet away but were about to be annihilated, that the entire Shogo operation was collapsing into disaster. What Kurita did know was that he was fighting an enemy that seemed to have inexhaustible reserves. Every time he damaged or sank an American ship, more appeared. Every time his anti-aircraft gunners shot down American planes, more arrived to take their place. At 0911 hours, Kurita made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his force to break off the attack and withdraw. The decision remains controversial among historians. Kurita's force still possessed overwhelming firepower, and the American escort carriers were nearly defenseless. But Kurita's reasoning reflected a deeper understanding of the strategic situation. He was not fighting for tactical victory, but for strategic survival, and he recognized that the Americans could afford losses that Japan could not. Even if he succeeded in sinking every ship of Taffy III, even if he reached the landing beaches and destroyed transport shipping, the Americans would return. They would bring more ships, more aircraft, more men, more supplies. The industrial machine that produced these weapons was untouchable, operating in factories thousands of miles away, protected by oceans and air defenses that Japanese forces could never reach. Japan, meanwhile, was losing ships and aircraft and pilots that could never be replaced. Every engagement, even victories, brought Japan closer to exhaustion. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and simple. America could outproduce Japan by factors of 10 or 20 to 1 in every category of war material. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in all its complexity and chaos demonstrated this reality with crushing finality. Japan committed virtually its entire surviving naval strength, 4 carriers, 9 battleships, 19 cruisers, 35 destroyers, and lost 3 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. American losses were 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. The Imperial Japanese Navy, as a coherent fighting force, ceased to exist after Leyte Gulf. Admiral Kurita's retreat from Samar encapsulated the third and final moment of realization. He understood, watching American aircraft swarm around his ships like angry hornets, that Japan was not fighting a conventional war that could be won through tactical brilliance or operational excellence. Japan was fighting an industrial giant that could absorb catastrophic losses and return stronger, that could produce weapons and train personnel faster than they could be destroyed, that possessed technological advantages in radar, communications, logistics, and fire control that Japan could not counter. The aircraft that kept appearing hour after hour, attacking with weapons that ranged from heavy bombs to depth charges to rockets, armed with whatever ordnance the escort carriers' magazines contained. The sheer improvisation of the American response-launching aircraft with anti-submarine weapons to attack battleships, making dummy runs to distract gunners, coordinating attacks through hand signals because radio procedures had broken down, all of this demonstrated a flexibility and determination that contradicted every Japanese assumption about American character. These were not soft, materialistic civilians playing at war. These were professionals who understood their mission and executed it with skill and courage that matched anything Japan could field. The recurring symbol throughout the Pacific War was American surplus, the ability to bring overwhelming material resources to bear in ways that Japanese commanders found incomprehensible. It appeared in the radar sets that allowed American ships to fight in darkness, in the supply ships that delivered mountains of equipment, in the aircraft that arrived in endless waves, in the fuel that American ships burned freely while Japanese vessels hoarded every gallon. This surplus was not accidental or wasteful, but strategic, the conscious application of industrial capacity to military problems. American planners understood that modern war was fundamentally logistical, that victory belonged to the side that could deliver more firepower, more supplies, more replacements to the combat zone faster and more reliably than the enemy. Japanese planners, shaped by a culture that celebrated austerity and spiritual discipline, misinterpreted American abundance as decadence. They believed that material superiority could be overcome through superior will and fighting spirit. The Jing-Sidi Pacific War proved otherwise. Spirit and courage mattered, but they could not substitute for radar-directed gunfire, could not replace sunken ships, could not transport supplies across submarine-infested waters, could not manufacture aircraft and train pilots at rates that matched American production. The transformation in Japanese strategic thinking came too late to alter the war's outcome. By 1945, Japanese commanders understood that they faced an opponent whose material advantages were insurmountable. But this understanding led not to surrender, but to desperation. The kamikaze attacks that began in October 1944 represented the logical conclusion of Japanese strategic bankruptcy, a recognition that conventional tactics could not inflict sufficient damage on American forces, that only suicide attacks could achieve meaningful hit rates against American ships protected by radar-directed anti-aircraft fire and superior fighter direction. The kamikaze strategy was militarily rational given Japanese constraints, but it was also an admission of defeat. A nation reduced to expending its pilots in single-use attacks had lost the ability to wage sustained warfare. American forces, meanwhile, developed increasingly effective countermeasures. Radar picket destroyers stationed around the fleet to provide early warning, combat air patrols directed by fighter controllers aboard ships, proximity-fused anti-aircraft, shells that detonated near targets rather than requiring direct hits. By mid-1945, American defenses had reduced kamikaze effectiveness to marginal levels, though the psychological impact remained significant. The end came not through naval battle, but through strategic bombing and atomic weapons. Yet the naval war had already determined the outcome. American control of the Pacific sea lanes allowed the establishment of air bases within striking range of the Japanese home islands, allowed the submarine blockade that starved Japan of resources, allowed the delivery of invasion forces that conquered island after island, tightening the noose around Japanese territory. The 3 moments of realization Midway's demonstration that American intelligence and tactical competence could defeat Japanese operational excellence, Guadalcanal's revelation that American logistics and industrial output could sustain forces that overwhelmed Japanese supply capabilities, and LEYTE Gulf's proof that American material superiority had reached levels that made Japanese resistance futile. These moments trace the arc of Japan's strategic collapse. Each moment stripped away another layer of illusion, another comfortable assumption about American weakness or Japanese superiority. Each moment forced Japanese commanders to confront the reality that they were fighting an enemy they had fundamentally misunderstood. The epilogue to this story is written in the wreckage that lies scattered across the floor of the Pacific Ocean. The carriers of the Kido Butai rest in deep water off Midway, their hulls crushed by pressure, their aircraft still, visible in some cases preserved in the cold and darkness. The battleship Musashi lies in the Sibuyan Sea, her massive hull broken but recognizable, a monument to the futility of building weapons that could be defeated by swarms of cheaper, more flexible systems. The destroyers and cruisers that fought. and dyed in iron baton sound rest beneath the waves that gave that strait its name, their positions marked on charts, their stories remembered by historians and veterans. These ships and the men who served aboard them were not defeated by cowardice or incompetence. They were defeated by the mathematics of industrial warfare, by an enemy whose productive capacity they had underestimated, whose determination they had misjudged, whose technological sophistication they had dismissed. The tragedy of the Pacific War, from the Japanese perspective, was that it was unwinnable from the start, that the assumptions undergirding Japanese strategy were flawed, that the calculations about American will and capability were wrong, that the empire's leadership had committed the nation to a war that mathematics and geography made impossible to win. The larger truth that emerged from the Pacific conflict transcends the immediate military outcomes. It speaks to the relationship between industrial capacity and national power in modern warfare, to the decisive importance of logistics and supply in sustained combat operations, to the limits of individual courage and tactical skill when confronted with overwhelming material superiority. The United States did not win the Pacific War through superior fighting spirit or cultural advantage. America won through production lines that never stopped, through shipyards that launched vessels faster than they could be sunk, through training programs that graduated pilots in numbers that replaced losses and built reserves, through technological development that created radar, proximity fuses, improved aircraft, and eventually atomic weapons. These were not the advantages of a soft or decadent society, but the products of a free, innovative, industrially advanced democracy that could mobilize its resources for total war while maintaining the political cohesion necessary to sustain years of costly fighting. The Japanese commanders who realized in those 3 terrible moments that they could not stop the American advance were not learning about American military strength alone. They were learning about the power of a system economic, political, and social that could translate industrial might into military victory on a scale that redefined modern warfare. The ocean that witnessed these battles remains the same vast, blue, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its surface. But the history written in those waters between 1942 and 1945 changed the world, demonstrating truths about power and capacity that resonate into the present. The Japanese commanders who stood on their bridges and watched American ships and aircraft overwhelm their forces were witnessing not merely tactical defeats, but the manifestation of a deeper reality, that in the industrial age wars are won by economies as much as by armies, that sustained conflict favors the power with greater productive capacity, and that military excellence without adequate logistical foundation is ultimately futile. These lessons, purchased at terrible cost in lives and treasure, remain relevant in an era when the relationship between industrial capacity and military power continues to shape the balance of forces between nations. The 3 moments when Japanese commanders realized they could not stop the American advance were not isolated tactical revelations, but windows into the fundamental nature of modern warfare, a form of conflict in which material abundance, technological sophistication, and logistical mastery combine to create advantages that courage and skill alone cannot overcome.